Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from, and what time has found you? The most misread god in Lovecraft's pantheon was never meant to be understood as a monster. It arrived instead as a marker, a biological coordinate, a depth measurement, a proof of duration that dwarfs human chronology. Not an antagonist waiting to rise, a presence confirming we were always irrelevant. This isn't a god that offers conflict. In Lovecraft's cosmos, Cthulhu doesn't war with humanity. It exists adjacent to us, on timescales where our entire species is a brief disturbance. The terror isn't malevolence. It's the recognition that malevolence requires awareness, and we do not register. We have transformed this entity into merchandise, into spectacle, into something fightable. What we've lost in translation isn't merely accuracy, it's the philosophical weight. Cthulhu was never written as evil. It was written as proof that evil, like good, is a human invention with no cosmic anchor. Consider this. Every depiction of Cthulhu as a conqueror or destroyer misses the point entirely. It doesn't destroy civilizations. It outlasts them. Its presence doesn't threaten our future. It contextualizes our past as forgettable. Tonight, we return to the text itself. Not to the merchandised image, but to what the entity actually represents. Indifference as a geological force, existence as an interruption of ours rather than the reverse. We'll examine why this distinction matters, why reducing cosmic horror to a monster diminishes the very architecture of dread Lovecraft constructed. And perhaps we'll understand the real failure. In making Cthulhu killable, we made ourselves the center of the story again. Which was always the comforting lie, cosmic horror was written to dissolve. Let us look at what was written before we decided what it meant. Howard Phillips Lovecraft composed The Call of Cthulhu between August and September 1926, submitting it to Weird Tales in July 1927. The story appeared in February 1928. This timing matters because Lovecraft had already articulated his philosophical framework in dozens of letters. Cosmic indifferentism, the term he preferred over nihilism, before Cthulhu existed on paper. The entity was designed to illustrate a pre-existing argument about humanity's cosmic status, not to function as a traditional monster. Farnsworth Wright, editor of Weird Tales, initially rejected the manuscript, finding it too diffuse, too lacking in conventional horror mechanics. When he finally accepted it, the story appeared with cover art, emphasizing tentacles and monstrosity, the visual grammar of pulp antagonism already distorting the philosophical content before most readers encountered the text. Lovecraft's correspondence from this period reveals deliberate intent. In a 1927 letter to Weird Tales contributor Duane Rimmel, he explained that his fictional entities were meant to represent forces beyond moral categorization, explicitly rejecting the good versus evil framework that structured most fantasy literature of the period. Cthulhu was not designed as Satan's analog or as a conquering emperor from the stars. The creature represented deep time made visceral, a thing that existed when Earth's landmasses held different configurations, that would exist after human civilization became archaeologically undetectable. Lovecraft wanted readers to experience the sensation of temporal irrelevance, the recognition that our species occupies a brief interval in geological chronology. The horror wasn't supposed to come from Cthulhu's potential actions, but from the realization that such a being's existence rendered human moral categories absurd. Yet within a decade of Lovecraft's death in 1937, the entity had been transformed. August Derleth, Lovecraft's correspondent and self-appointed literary executor, began systematizing what he termed the Cthulhu Mythos, a phrase Lovecraft never used. Derleth imposed a cosmic war narrative, positioning the Great Old Ones as evil deities opposed by benevolent elder gods. This reframing accomplished something Lovecraft had specifically worked to prevent. It made the cosmos legible through human ethical frameworks. Cthulhu became a villain, which meant humanity became relevant enough to have villains. The very structure of Derleth's systematization contradicted Lovecraft's philosophical project, yet it became the template for decades of derivative fiction, gaming systems, and popular understanding. The commercial pressures operating on pulp fiction in the 1920s and 1930s cannot be dismissed as peripheral context. Weird Tales survived on newsstand sales, competing with dozens of other magazines through cover illustrations that promised visceral thrills. Monsters sold copies. Philosophical treatises on cosmic insignificance did not. The economic logic of pulp publishing required entities like Cthulhu to function as threats, as things heroes could potentially defeat or at least escape. This created an immediate tension between Lovecraft's intent and market demands, a tension resolved by emphasizing the tentacles and diminishing the temporal indifference. When readers saw the February 1928 cover, they expected a monster story. The text delivered something else, but the visual framing had already established interpretive expectations that proved remarkably durable. Consider what Lovecraft omitted from his story. There is no explanation of how to fight Cthulhu, no ancient weapon or spell that might banish it, no heroic resistance that achieves anything beyond momentary delay. The alert crew's steamship ramming Cthulhu's head accomplishes nothing permanent. The entity reforms. Johansen escapes not through valor, but through accident of timing, and the stars becoming wrong again. The story contains no agency, no human capacity to meaningfully affect cosmic forces. This absence is structural, not incidental. Lovecraft was writing against the grain of pulp narrative conventions, attempting to craft dread from helplessness rather than from defeatable menace. The fact that subsequent adaptations consistently add battle mechanics, resistance movements, or ultimate weapons reveals how uncomfortable this framework makes us. We require our monsters to notice us. Lovecraft designed Cthulhu to demonstrate what happens when something exists on scales where noticing is impossible. The misreading began immediately, continued through posthumous systematizations, and persists because the alternative, accepting irrelevance, remains psychologically intolerable for most narrative consumers. Lovecraft arrived at cosmic indifferentism through deliberate intellectual scaffolding, not through isolated imagination. His philosophical education, though largely autodidactic, drew heavily from late 19th century materialism and the scientific developments that had dismantled anthropocentric cosmology. Arthur Schopenhauer's concept of the will, a blind, purposeless force driving existence, provided one template for understanding cosmic processes devoid of intention or consciousness. Schopenhauer's will didn't hate humanity. It didn't acknowledge humanity's existence as meaningful. This philosophical groundwork gave Lovecraft language for something pulp fiction had never attempted. Horror derived not from evil, but from the absence of any framework that would make evil conceptually coherent at cosmic scales. The universe operates through material forces, not through moral dramas, and entities operating on geological timescales would no more possess human legible motivations than tectonic plates possess political opinions. Friedrich Nietzsche's proclamation of God's death created a different kind of vacuum, one Lovecraft explored through inversion. Where Nietzsche saw opportunity for human self-determination in the absence of divine authority, Lovecraft saw the removal of cosmic scaffolding that had made human existence narratively significant. If God's death meant the universe contained no inherent meaning, then human-generated meaning became a local phenomenon, a psychological comfort without external validation. Cthulhu functions as what remains when you remove not just God, but the entire framework that made God conceptually necessary. There is no benevolent order, but there is also no malevolent chaos. There is only material existence, time, and scale. The entity isn't Satan, because Satan requires God's architecture to have meaning. Cthulhu exists in a cosmos where the God-Satan binary never had reference. Charles Darwin's evolutionary theory had already accomplished the biological version of this displacement by the time Lovecraft was born in 1890. Natural selection operated without foresight or purpose, producing complexity through mechanical processes rather than divine intention. Victorian and Edwardian intellectuals struggled to maintain human exceptionalism in the face of this evidence. We might be products of blind material processes, but surely consciousness, culture, and morality elevated us above mere evolutionary products. Lovecraft rejected this compromise entirely. If evolution demonstrated that human biology resulted from purposeless material forces, then human consciousness was equally contingent, equally lacking cosmic privilege. Cthulhu emerges from this logic, a being whose existence predates human evolution, whose material form obeys different biological principles, and whose presence demonstrates that the cosmos produces conscious entities without caring about their moral frameworks or existential anxieties. The theosophical movements flourishing in late 19th and early 20th century Western culture offered another reference point, though one Lovecraft systematically inverted. Theosophy promised ancient wisdom, secret knowledge that would reveal humanity's cosmic significance and spiritual potential. Madame Blavatsky's writings described root races, ascended masters, and evolutionary spiritual development, all positioning humanity as cosmically important and potentially transcendent. Lovecraft took the aesthetic trappings, ancient texts, forbidden knowledge, entities from before human history, and stripped away the consoling framework. His ancient knowledge doesn't elevate the knower, it reveals their irrelevance. The Necronomicon, his fictional grimoire, contains truths that drive readers mad, not through spiritual pollution, but through accurate comprehension of cosmic scale. Where theosophy promised gnosis would make you cosmically significant, Lovecraft's forbidden texts reveal you never were. Lord Dunsany's influence on Lovecraft's early work is well documented, but the divergence matters as much as the influence. Dunsany's dream realms operated through aesthetic logic. Beauty, strangeness, wonder structured those impossible geographies. His gods possessed personality, engaged in comprehensible conflicts, and existed in relation to human imagination. Lovecraft borrowed the toolkit, otherworldly realms, entities beyond normal physics, dreamlands accessible to certain individuals, but replaced Dunsany's aesthetic logic with mechanistic materialism. Lovecraft's dream sendings in The Call of Cthulhu aren't mystical visions, but telepathic radiation from a physical entity whose brain patterns intersect with sensitive human nervous systems during particular astronomical configurations. The poetic language describing non-Euclidean geometry isn't metaphor for spiritual otherness. It's attempting to render actual mathematical relationships that human spatial cognition cannot process. Where Dunsany's impossible realms invite wonder, Lovecraft's invite recognition of cognitive limitation. The archaeological discoveries of the late 19th century provided concrete imagery for these abstract frameworks. Egyptology had revealed civilizations whose material culture survived millennia after their belief systems became incomprehensible. The Epic of Gilgamesh, decoded from cuneiform tablets, demonstrated that entire literary traditions could vanish from human memory and be rediscovered as alien artifacts. These findings proved civilizations could be forgotten completely, that cultural memory had definite limits, and that material evidence persisted longer than any continuous tradition. Lovecraft extrapolated. If human civilizations could vanish into archaeological silence, then pre-human civilizations, biologically alien ones, might have left traces that human investigators would misinterpret through anthropocentric assumptions. The sleeping god imagery that appears across multiple religious traditions became, in Lovecraft's hands, not metaphor, but geological fact. Cthulhu isn't sleeping in the mythological sense. It's buried under specific Pacific coordinates, its metabolism operating on timescales that make sleep and wakefulness crude, approximations of alien biological states. These philosophical and cultural threads converged in Lovecraft's work during the mid-1920s, a period when he was reading extensively in popular science, corresponding with amateur astronomers, and absorbing materialist philosophy through whatever texts he could access. Cthulhu emerged from this convergence, not as isolated imaginative creation, but as the fictional embodiment of what happened when you took scientific materialism seriously and refused the consoling compromises most writers offered. The entity represented what remained when you removed human specialness, divine purpose, and cosmic meaning from the universe, but kept everything else: time, space, matter, and the terrifying possibility that consciousness might arise accidentally, persist briefly, and vanish without cosmic consequence. The name Cthulhu arrives in English text already marked as unpronounceable, a deliberate linguistic choice that establishes the entity's resistance to human categorical systems before any physical description occurs. Lovecraft's narrator in The Call of Cthulhu explains that the word approximates sounds produced by vocal organs shaped differently from human ones. The text explicitly frames the name as phonetic compromise, rather than accurate transcription. This isn't exotic flavor added for atmosphere. It's epistemological claim. If we cannot pronounce the entity's actual name, we cannot fully conceptualize it through language-dependent thought. The unpronounceable name functions as the first evidence that human cognitive equipment cannot adequately process what it's encountering. Other writers had used invented languages for otherworldly entities, but Lovecraft positioned the pronunciation gap as evidence of biological incompatibility between human and non-human consciousness. The physical descriptions of Cthulhu demonstrate similar resistance to categorical stability. The 1926 text describes a monster of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws on hind and forefeet, and long, narrow wings behind. This description assembles components from multiple biological categories: cephalopod, reptile, humanoid, chiropteran, without cohering into a recognizable organism. The creature isn't a hybrid in the mythological sense, where gods combine animal features symbolically. It's described as if evolution proceeded along different principles, producing morphology that human taxonomic systems cannot accommodate. The vaguely anthropoid outline particularly matters because it suggests convergent evolution might produce bipedal forms through non-human developmental pathways, undermining the assumption that humanoid shape indicates human-like consciousness or motivation. Relier's non-Euclidean geometry serves parallel epistemological function. Johansson's manuscript describes architecture where the geometry of the dream place he saw was abnormal, non-Euclidean, and loathsomely redolent of spheres and dimensions apart from ours. This isn't poetic embellishment, but mathematical claim. Euclidean geometry, parallel lines never meeting, angles and triangles summing to 180 degrees, space behaving consistently across scales, describes the physics we evolved to navigate. Non-Euclidean geometries, developed in the 19th century, demonstrated that consistent logical systems could produce spatial relationships incompatible with human intuition. Lovecraft was aware of these developments through popular science writing. By positioning Aurelia's architecture as physically instantiating non-Euclidean space, he suggested the city wasn't merely alien in design, but operated under different physical principles than terrestrial matter. The nausea and disorientation Johansson experiences isn't psychological horror. It's what happens when human sensory equipment encounters space organized through principles it didn't evolve to process. The phrase "dead but dreaming" requires careful parsing because casual reading renders it mystical when the text presents it as biological description. In The Call of Cthulhu, this phrase comes from cultist belief, not from omniscient narration. The cultists interpret Cthulhu's state through concepts available to human understanding, death and dreams being states they possess language for. The text suggests instead a metabolic state that superficially resembles death by human criteria. No respiration, no movement, no apparent consciousness, while maintaining some biological process analogous to dreaming. This reading gains support from the story's mechanism. Cthulhu's dreams apparently generate telepathic radiation that sensitive humans detect. If the entity is genuinely dead, it cannot produce detectable mental activity. If it's dreaming in the human sense, it possesses psychology legible through human categories. The text implies, instead, a third state, reduced metabolic function, maintaining enough neural activity to produce the electromagnetic patterns humans interpret as dreams when those patterns intersect with human nervous systems. The chant, Fenglui Magalwinaf Cthulhu Relier Wagahnagel Ftagn, appears in multiple contexts throughout the story, always secondhand, quoted by cultists, translated by scholars, never directly verified. The generally accepted translation, "In his house at Relier dead Cthulhu waits dreaming," has achieved canonical status despite the text providing no mechanism for verification. Lovecraft intentionally included no Rosetta Stone for his invented languages, no dictionary that would allow independent confirmation. The translation might be accurate, but it might equally represent what human linguists assumed the chant meant, based on cultist glosses and contextual inference. This ambiguity is structural. If the chant accurately describes Cthulhu's state, it provides information. If the chant represents human misunderstanding of incomprehensible vocalizations, it demonstrates the limits of human linguistic systems. Either interpretation serves Lovecraft's framework. We are working with insufficient tools. The astronomical component deserves attention because it's frequently misread as mystical alignment when the text frames it as mechanical causation. The story references "when the stars were right," a phrase that has accumulated occult associations through decades of derivative fiction. In Lovecraft's 1926 text, this phrase appears in cultist doctrine, but gains mechanical explanation through the 1925 earthquake that frees Orlaya temporarily. The right star positions apparently correlate with specific gravitational or electromagnetic conditions that affect Orlaya's geological prison. This isn't astrology. It's astrophysics filtered through human observers who lack the mathematical sophistication to describe the actual causal mechanism. The stars aren't mystically right or wrong. They're in configurations that produce measurable physical effects, which human witnesses interpret through the conceptual frameworks available to them. The cultists understand this as religious doctrine because they lack the scientific language to describe gravitational mechanics at astronomical scales. What the text establishes through these linguistic and symbolic elements is epistemological limitation as horror premise. We cannot pronounce the entity's name correctly. We cannot visualize its physical form coherently. We cannot navigate the space it inhabits without sensory breakdown. We cannot verify translations of its associated texts. We cannot distinguish between religious interpretation and physical description in the evidence available. Each symbolic element, name, appearance, location, state of being, associated language, demonstrates human cognitive equipment encountering phenomena it evolved no capacity to process accurately. The horror isn't that Cthulhu exists. The horror is that it exists in ways we lack the equipment to understand, which means we cannot assess threat, cannot develop appropriate response, and cannot even achieve clarity about what we're attempting to understand. The symbolic language of cosmic horror doesn't obscure meaning for atmospheric effect. It demonstrates meaning's absence when observer and observed operate on incommensurable scales. Lovecraft's pseudo-biblia strategy represents one of his most significant technical innovations, and its misunderstanding underlies much subsequent misreading of Cthulhu's function. The Necronomicon first appears in The Hound, 1922, years before Cthulhu's creation, and Lovecraft deployed it across multiple stories as a shared reference point, not to build a coherent mythology, but to create what he called in correspondence an atmosphere of verisimilitude. Real occult traditions reference common texts. Real scholarship cites precedent sources. By inventing the Necronomicon, the Pinacotic manuscripts, and other fictional grimoires, then having multiple narrators across different stories reference these texts, Lovecraft generated the textual infrastructure of authenticity without actual, coherent content. The Necronomicon never appears directly in any story. It's always quoted, summarized, or referenced by characters who may be unreliable. This structure is crucial. Lovecraft created mythology without worshipable deities, scholarship without verifiable claims, and ancient wisdom that consistently drives readers mad rather than enlightening them. The distinction between building mythology and inverting religious structure becomes clearer when examining what the Necronomicon supposedly contains versus what real grimoires claim to offer. Traditional magical texts promise power, instructions for summoning entities, binding them to your will, gaining knowledge or influence through proper ritual. The Necronomicon, in the fragments quoted across Lovecraft's fiction, offers no such power. It describes what exists, what has existed, and what will exist, regardless of human action. The infamous, "that is not dead, which can eternal lie," and with strange aeons, even death may die, couplet from The Nameless City, 1921, became associated with Cthulhu through cross-textual reference. But note what it doesn't say. It provides no method for preventing what's described, no ritual for protection, no framework for human agency. It's descriptive, not prescriptive. This matters enormously. If the Necronomicon were a genuine magical text in the fictional universe, it would offer techniques for confronting the entities it describes. Instead, it functions as forbidden knowledge in the most literal sense, knowledge whose accurate comprehension produces despair rather than power. Cthulhu appears as primary entity in exactly one Lovecraft story, The Call of Cthulhu itself. It receives mentions in The Dunwich Horror, 1928, At the Mountains of Madness, 1931, and The Shadow Out of Time, 1934-35. But these references position it as one entity among many in a cosmos crowded with non-human intelligences operating on various scales. This textual marginality is deliberate. If Cthulhu were meant to function as central antagonist, Lovecraft would have used it repeatedly as the primary threat. Instead, each story features different entities, different threats, different manifestations of cosmic indifference. Yog-Sothoth, Shub-Niggurath, the Elder Things, the great race of Yith. The pattern suggests Cthulhu serves as example rather than exception. The specific entity matters less than the framework it demonstrates. Ancient, powerful, utterly indifferent to human existence. Cthulhu became iconic not through textual dominance, but through the story's structure, which provided the clearest articulation of Lovecraft's philosophical position. The Cthulhu cult, as depicted in The Call of Cthulhu, reveals itself through pathology rather than power. Inspector Legrasse's 1908 raid on the Louisiana swamp cult discovers primitive rites, human sacrifice, and chanting in unknown languages. But these cultists aren't depicted as powerful or sophisticated. They're described as of a very low, mixed-blooded, and mentally aberrant type, engaging in practices that horrify the local black population, who report them to authorities, and that police easily suppress through direct intervention. The cult possesses no supernatural protection, no magical abilities, no effective resistance to mundane law enforcement. Their beliefs may be accurate regarding Cthulhu's existence, but this accuracy grants them nothing except the burden of knowing. Lovecraft's depiction is deliberately unromantic. These aren't mysterious initiates with secret wisdom, but damaged people whose mental instability makes them receptive to telepathic intrusions they lack capacity to interpret correctly. Johansson's manuscript provides the story's climactic encounter, and its narrative structure repays close attention. The manuscript is second-hand document, translated from Norwegian, provided to Thurston by Mrs. Johansson after her husband's death. And even within the manuscript, Johansson acknowledges perceptual breakdown during the Arlia encounter. The alert crew sees Cthulhu, but the description fragments into contradictions. The entity's size appears variable, its movements defy spatial logic, and Johansson's language resorts to dream imagery when attempting physical documentation. This isn't Lovecraft's prose style interfering with clarity. It's Johansson's documented inability to process what he's perceiving through sense equipment that evolved for different purposes. The manuscript within story structure creates layers of potential unreliability while simultaneously providing the most direct account available. We cannot verify Johansson's account against external sources, yet it remains the only eyewitness description of the entity itself. The academic framing devices Lovecraft employed across his fiction serve to emphasize rather than overcome epistemic limitation. Francis Wayland Thurston, the narrator of The Call of Cthulhu, is a scholar investigating his uncle's research. He assembles documents, compares accounts, searches for patterns, and achieves no useful understanding. His investigation confirms Cthulhu's existence, correlates various evidence streams, and produces no actionable knowledge. The story concludes with Thurston expressing hope that he hasn't been noticed, that his death will appear natural, that the knowledge he's gained will die with him. This represents scholarship's failure in Lovecraft's framework. Rational investigation, careful documentation, and cross-referencing evidence can confirm cosmic horror's existence, but cannot produce strategies for addressing it. The academic apparatus generates knowledge that operates like poison, accurate, detailed, and exclusively harmful to the knower. The function of cultists across Lovecraft's work consistently illustrates human weakness rather than cosmic truth. They worship entities that don't notice worship, perform rituals that accomplish nothing supernatural, and mistake cosmic indifference for attention. The cultists represent humanity's desperate attempt to establish relationship with forces that operate on scales where relationship is impossible. They want to matter to Cthulhu. They want their devotion to generate reciprocal attention. The text provides no evidence they receive any such attention. Their dreams come from telepathic radiation. Cthulhu generates involuntarily, not messages sent intentionally. Worship is entirely one-directional. This might be the story's cruelest element. Even degrading yourself through worship of an entity that represents cosmic indifference cannot make that entity care. The cultists have sacrificed their humanity for nothing, which is precisely what cosmic indifferentism predicts. Human meaning-making activities, religion, worship, sacrifice, ritual, function psychologically but produce no cosmic effects. Lovecraft's myth-building succeeded not because he created a coherent pantheon, but because he created the textual infrastructure that made readers believe such a pantheon existed outside the text. The cross-references, the shared bibliography, the overlapping chronologies, these generated the sensation of depth without requiring actual systematization. Other writers noticed the technique and contributed their own stories, creating collaborative mythology without coordinating content. This organic growth pattern meant no single authority controlled the mythos, which accelerated its evolution beyond Lovecraft's intentions and contributed directly to systematic misreading. Once August Derleth began codifying the Cthulhu Mythos with good versus evil frameworks, the virus had already spread beyond any single person's capacity to correct. The pseudo-biblia strategy worked too well, producing belief in coherent mythology that Lovecraft never wrote and specifically didn't want to create. He intended verisimilitude. He achieved unintentional canon that subsequent generations would mistake for intentional design. Cosmic indifferentism operates through absence rather than opposition, not the universe's hostility toward humanity, but its complete failure to register humanity as significant enough to hate. Lovecraft distinguished his position carefully in correspondence, rejecting both optimistic humanism and nihilistic despair as insufficiently accurate. The universe, he argued, contains no evidence of caring about human values, human survival, or human comprehension. Matter organizes itself through physical law. Time proceeds without narrative structure. Consciousness emerges accidentally and locally, producing organisms capable of suffering without the cosmos containing any mechanism to acknowledge or address that suffering. Cthulhu functions as this framework's biological instantiation, an entity whose existence predates human evolution, whose survival extends beyond potential human extinction, and whose mental activity never intersects meaningfully with human consciousness despite physical proximity. The entity doesn't hate humanity. Hatred requires recognition of the hated subject as worthy of emotional response. consider what the text carefully avoids. There is no moment where Cthulhu notices humanity in any meaningful sense. The alert crew encounters the entity because they accidentally arrive at Arlaia during its temporary surfacing. Cthulhu emerges from the city, moves toward the ship, and when Johansson rams it with the steamship, the entity's head explodes and reforms. But nothing in this sequence suggests intentional aggression. Cthulhu moves. The ship happens to be in that direction. The collision occurs. The entity reforms and continues moving. This is the behavior of something navigating space without registering the presence of organisms too small, too brief, and too cognitively distant to merit attention. We observe bacteria under microscopes. We study their behavior. We learn from them. We do not notice individual bacteria as subjects worthy of relationship. Lovecraft inverted the scale. Humanity becomes the bacteria. Cthulhu, the microscope operator, who doesn't realize the slide contains anything conscious. The temporal framework matters enormously because time operates differently at different scales. Cthulhu's civilization, according to the fragments quoted in The Call of Cthulhu, existed millions of years before humanity evolved. The elder things in At the Mountains of Madness, 1931, discovered evidence of Cthulhu's kind already ancient when the elder things arrived on Earth hundreds of millions of years ago. These timescales transform the meaning of consciousness. Human consciousness persists for decades. Human civilizations persist for thousands of years. Human species identity might persist for hundreds of thousands of years before evolutionary pressure produces sufficient change to require taxonomic reclassification. Cthulhu's consciousness has persisted for millions of years, possibly tens of millions. At that scale, human history, from agricultural revolution to nuclear weapons, occupies a span equivalent to a few seconds in a human lifetime. Would you notice something that existed for 3 seconds? Would you develop emotional responses to it? Would its presence or absence meaningfully affect your behavior? The prison of Arlaia complicates straightforward readings because the text provides no evidence of intentional imprisonment. The city sank during some geological catastrophe, trapping Cthulhu and its kin under Pacific Ocean waters. This reads as accident of plate tectonics rather than divine punishment or magical binding. No entity imprisoned Cthulhu. Geological processes changed Earth's surface configuration, and the entity found itself in circumstances unsuitable for activity. The 1925 earthquake temporarily raises Arlaia, demonstrating the prison is geological rather than metaphysical. Seismic activity can free what seismic activity trapped. This matters because it removes agency from cosmic horror's framework. No good gods locked away the evil gods. Material processes occurred, producing configurations that sometimes contain entities and sometimes release them. The cosmos operates mechanically. Cthulhu's eventual freedom isn't about prophecy or cosmic battle, it's about geological inevitability. Plate tectonics will continue. Arlaia will surface permanently eventually. And that surfacing changes nothing fundamental about reality, because Cthulhu's existence never depended on human awareness. Why doesn't Cthulhu's awakening change anything fundamental? Because the entity was always there. Its presence under Pacific waters already established cosmic indifference as operative principle. Whether dormant or active, Cthulhu's existence proves human significance is local phenomenon. When the entity eventually wakes and moves freely across Earth's surface, this will inconvenience humanity enormously, the way construction inconveniences ant colonies when bulldozers arrive. The construction isn't directed at the ants, the ants happen to have built their colony where construction is scheduled. Human cities, human infrastructure, human civilization occupies space that something operating on Cthulhu's scale might move through without registering the civilization's existence. The awakening doesn't reveal cosmic truth. It makes already existing cosmic truth physically inconvenient for human organisms. We were always irrelevant. We might simply survive longer if the entities demonstrating our irrelevance remain dormant in inaccessible locations. Lovecraft embedded this philosophy throughout the Call of Cthulhu through structural choices as much as explicit statement. The story concludes with no resolution. Cthulhu returns to dormancy not through human action, but through astronomical conditions changing. Thurston survives not through heroism, but through accident of having investigated after the relevant events concluded. The knowledge he's gained produces no actionable strategy. His final paragraphs express hope for death before the entities notice his investigations, revealing that the deepest terror comes from the possibility of being seen by something you cannot comprehend and cannot hide from. But even this fear may be narcissistic. Cthulhu almost certainly won't notice. And that failure to be noticed, that confirmation of insignificance, proves more disturbing than malevolent attention would be. The great old ones function as categorical problem rather than as species designation, and this distinction matters for understanding Cthulhu's nature. Lovecraft's texts provide no consistent taxonomy for these entities. They're described variously as beings from other dimensions, organisms from Earth's deep past, and entities that predate Earth's formation. The inconsistency is deliberate rather than careless. Real taxonomy emerges from evolutionary relationships, shared morphology, and reproductive compatibility. The great old ones resist these frameworks because they may not be biologically related at all. The category might represent human convenience, an attempt to group entities that share only the characteristic of being incomprehensible to human observation. Cthulhu gets classified with Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, and Shub-Niggurath not because they share evolutionary ancestry, but because they all exceed human cognitive capacity. This makes great old ones less a taxonomic designation and more an admission of classificatory failure. Cthulhu's textual relations demonstrate concentric circles of alienness, each layer revealing something about scale and consciousness. The spawn of Cthulhu appear in the Call of Cthulhu as smaller entities accompanying the primary being, still immense by human standards, still morphologically impossible by terrestrial biology, but apparently related to Cthulhu as offspring or creations. The star spawn mentioned across multiple texts might represent an earlier generation or a different biological relationship entirely. The deep ones from The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1931, worship Cthulhu alongside Dagon, suggesting religious relationship rather than biological connection, though their amphibious biology hints at shared aquatic origin. These relationships remain deliberately vague because Lovecraft understood that over-explaining alien biology would make it comprehensible, which would domesticate the horror. The entities remain partially described, their relationships suggested, but never mapped completely. The distinction between Cthulhu and what we might call Tier 1 entities, Azathoth, Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep in some manifestations, reveals scale operating within scale. Azathoth, described across multiple texts as the nuclear chaos at the center of infinity, represents cosmological force rather than localized entity. Yog-Sothoth exists across all time and space simultaneously. coterminous with the universe itself. These entities operate at such vast scales that they cannot be geographically imprisoned, cannot be accidentally encountered, and cannot meaningfully interact with three-dimensional space in ways human consciousness processes coherently. Cthulhu, by contrast, can be imprisoned. It occupies specific spatial coordinates. Johansson's crew encounters it and survives temporarily. This positions Cthulhu as cosmologically local, powerful beyond human measure but not omnipresent, ancient beyond human comprehension but not eternal in the sense of existing outside time. The entity is geographically bound, which means it operates within physical law, even if that law permits configurations humans lack experience with. The dreaming is telepathy. Mechanism deserves careful attention because it provides the clearest evidence of how Cthulhu intersects with human consciousness without intending to. Throughout February and March 1925, artists and sensitive individuals worldwide experience similar nightmares: non-Euclidean architecture, immense presences, crushing sensations of cosmic scope. These dreams correlate precisely with the period when Arlier surfaces temporarily due to seismic activity. Lovecraft's text suggests the dreaming functions as unintentional telepathic broadcast. Cthulhu's neural activity generates patterns that sensitive human nervous systems detect and attempt to process. The dreams aren't messages, they're noise, electromagnetic or psychic radiation produced by consciousness operating at scales and through mechanisms humans evolved no capacity to receive. The sensitive individuals aren't chosen. They're simply unfortunate enough to possess nervous systems configured to detect these patterns. This is crucial because it removes intentionality from the interaction. Cthulhu isn't sending dreams. Humans are accidentally picking up broadcasts never meant for them. Artists and visionaries appear repeatedly throughout the story as unwilling receivers, which inverts the romantic tradition of artistic inspiration. Henry Wilcox sculpts Cthulhu's image based on dreams he doesn't understand, producing art that disturbs him profoundly. Other artists mentioned in Thurston's research experienced similar intrusions, creating work that made them uncomfortable while compelling them toward its completion. This isn't the muse speaking to the artist, granting divine inspiration. This is mental pollution. Human consciousness forced to process patterns it lacks equipment for, producing compromised art that captures fragments of something its creator cannot comprehend. The art troubles viewers because it successfully transmits a fraction of what the artist involuntarily received, spreading the cognitive disturbance through aesthetic transmission. Lovecraft himself described this story as emerging from a nightmare, suggesting he understood artistic creation as potentially involuntary response to stimuli the conscious mind doesn't control. The Alert's encounter provides the only direct physical interaction between humans and Cthulhu in Lovecraft's work, and its details reveal the entity's relationship to material reality. Johansson describes Cthulhu as viscous. When the steamship rams its head, the matter doesn't shatter or bleed, but explodes and reconstitutes through what reads like non-Newtonian fluid behavior. The entity possesses physical substance, but that substance obeys principles Johansson's perceptual equipment cannot categorize. It's neither solid nor liquid, or it's both simultaneously, or it's something terrestrial physics lacks vocabulary for. The critical detail, ramming the entity, accomplishes nothing permanent. Cthulhu reforms, apparently uninjured, and continues moving. This demonstrates that even direct physical violence using industrial-age technology produces no lasting effect. The entity can be temporarily disrupted, but cannot be meaningfully harmed through methods that would destroy terrestrial organisms. This isn't supernatural invulnerability. its biological difference so profound that harm becomes category error. Physical form versus mental projection creates ongoing interpretive difficulty because the text supports both readings simultaneously. Did the alert crew encounter Cthulhu's actual body, or did they experience its mental projection while the body remained deeper in Arlee? Johansson's perceptual breakdown during the encounter, his inability to accurately describe size, distance, or movement, suggests human sensory equipment failing to process what it's perceiving. The entity might be physically present while remaining perceptually impossible, or the physical presence might generate mental effects so powerful they override accurate sensory processing. Lovecraft intentionally refused to resolve this ambiguity because both possibilities serve his philosophical framework. Either Cthulhu's material body exceeds human perceptual capacity, or its mental presence overwhelms human consciousness, or both occur simultaneously. Any of these options demonstrates humanity's cognitive inadequacy when confronting entities operating on sufficiently different scales. Madness in Lovecraft's cosmic horror framework operates through comprehension rather than through attack, and this mechanism distinguishes his work from supernatural horror traditions where madness results from demonic influence or curse. Characters in The Call of Cthulhu go mad because they accurately understand something their cognitive architecture evolved no capacity to process. Henry Wilcox becomes feverish and delirious after dreaming of Relia, not because Cthulhu attacks his mind, but because his brain attempts to organize sensory information about non-Euclidean space using neural structures shaped by Euclidean experience. The Louisiana cultists exhibit what early 20th century psychology termed mental aberration, not because worship of Cthulhu corrupts them, but because they've achieved partial comprehension of their cosmic insignificance while lacking philosophical frameworks to metabolize that knowledge. Johansson suffers psychological collapse after the alert encounter because witnessing something that cannot exist by terrestrial biology's rules breaks the assumption that perception reliably reports reality. The madness is epistemological damage. What happens when you learn true things your mind cannot accommodate? The function of sensitive individuals throughout Lovecraft's work reveals both his engagement with contemporary psychology and his inversion of spiritualist frameworks. The early 20th century inherited Victorian assumptions about heightened sensitivity as spiritual gift. Mediums, visionaries, and artists supposedly access truths unavailable to ordinary consciousness. Lovecraft weaponized this assumption. His sensitive characters do access truths unavailable to ordinary consciousness, but these truths destroy rather than elevate them. Wilcox's artistic sensitivity makes him vulnerable to telepathic intrusion, not spiritually advanced. The sensitive individuals suffer first and most intensely because their nervous systems respond to stimuli that most humans' perceptual filtering mechanisms successfully ignore. This is curse, not gift. The ability to detect Cthulhu's neural activity doesn't grant understanding. It grants exposure to patterns that damage the receiver. Lovecraft's inversion is complete. The more sensitive you are, the more you suffer, and your suffering teaches you nothing useful. Why cultists are pathetic rather than powerful requires examining Lovecraft's systematic refusal of magical agency throughout his cosmic horror fiction. The Louisiana cultists practice human sacrifice, chant in unknown languages, and maintain traditions supposedly derived from ancient knowledge. Yet none of this grants them power, protection, or meaningful communion with Cthulhu. Inspector Legrasse's police force disperses them through conventional force. Their rituals accomplish nothing supernatural, no protection from mundane violence, no retaliation from offended entities, no mystical barrier police cannot cross. The cultists believe they serve Cthulhu, believe their worship matters, believe their sacrifices generate reciprocal attention. The text provides no evidence supporting these beliefs. They're delusional individuals organizing their delusions through religious structure, mistaking coincidence, their dreams coinciding with Cthulhu's periods of neural activity for communication. Their worship is entirely one-directional. This is perhaps Lovecraft's cruelest proposition. Even degrading yourself through worship of cosmic indifference cannot make that indifference notice you. The 1925 earthquake functions as mechanical cause rather than mystical trigger, revealing Lovecraft's commitment to materialist explanation even within fantastic fiction. The earthquake creates sufficient geological disruption to temporarily raise R'lyeh from the ocean floor. This surfacing changes Cthulhu's position relative to human civilization. The entity moves closer to locations where humans exist, increasing the intensity of telepathic radiation that sensitive individuals detect. The mechanism is material. Seismic activity produces physical displacement, which alters distance between transmitter and receiver, which changes signal strength. No mystical forces operate. No ancient prophecy fulfills itself. Geological processes occur. Entities trapped by previous geological configurations achieve temporary freedom. Human nervous systems detect changed conditions. When subsequent seismic activity or oceanic patterns submerge R'lyeh again, the telepathic signal diminishes and sensitive individuals recover, not because evil has been defeated, but because distance, once again, attenuates the signal below human detection threshold. Johansson's survival carries profound implications because it demonstrates that encountering Cthulhu directly doesn't necessarily kill you immediately. He survives the R'lyeh encounter, makes it back to civilization, and lives long enough to document his experience before dying. The text implies, from delayed psychological collapse rather than immediate physical destruction. This survival suggests several disturbing possibilities. First, Cthulhu genuinely didn't notice the alert crew as worthy of attention. The entity moved through space occupied by the ship. The collision occurred, and Cthulhu continued without registering the interaction as significant. Second, human consciousness can survive direct perception of Cthulhu if exposure remains brief. The damage is psychological and delayed rather than instantaneous. Third, and most unsettling, surviving such an encounter provides no useful knowledge. Johansson gains nothing from his survival except trauma and the burden of knowing something he cannot communicate effectively. His manuscript attempts documentation, but fragments into contradictory descriptions when approaching the entity itself. He survives, but survival teaches him only that survival is possible while accomplishing nothing. Does Cthulhu actually notice humanity? The textual evidence consistently suggests no, not in any meaningful sense. When the entity emerges from R'lyeh and encounters the alert, the interaction resembles collision rather than confrontation. Cthulhu moves. The ship occupies space. Cthulhu moves through. Matter intersects. Johansson rams the steamship into Cthulhu's head, producing temporary disruption, and Cthulhu reforms and continues as if the collision were minor obstacle rather than attack. There's no pursuit when the crew escapes. There's no retaliation. There's no indication the entity registered the humans as conscious organisms attempting resistance. This absence of recognition operates as more profound horror than malevolent attention would provide. We want our monsters to notice us, even if that notice brings doom, because notice confirms we matter enough to warrant doom. Cthulhu denies us even that consolation. The entity exists, moves through space we happen to occupy, and our presence or absence makes no difference to its trajectory. The distinction between going mad from Cthulhu versus mad about Cthulhu maps onto the difference between direct and indirect traumatic exposure. Characters like Johansson, who encounter the entity, directly suffer madness from comprehension. Their nervous systems attempt to process impossible sensory information, producing cascading cognitive failures. Characters like Thurston, who learn about Cthulhu through research, suffer madness about the knowledge. They comprehend cosmic indifference intellectually, which collapses their assumptions about human significance, but doesn't damage their perceptual equipment. Both forms of madness appear throughout Lovecraft's work. Both are irreversible. But the madness from direct encounter operates through biological mechanism, sensory overload producing neural damage, while madness from knowledge operates through philosophical mechanism, accurate comprehension producing existential collapse. Neither form offers recovery because recovery would require either unlearning true things or achieving comfort with cosmic insignificance, and Lovecraft's framework suggests both are impossible for psychologically normal humans. What the Cthulhu cult actually knows versus what they believe separates epistemology from faith in ways that illuminate forbidden knowledge's function throughout cosmic horror. The cultists know, with varying degrees of accuracy, that non-human entities predate human civilization, that these entities sometimes communicate through dreams, and that geological changes might release imprisoned entities from physical constraints. This knowledge is verifiable. Thurston's investigation confirms all three propositions through independent evidence streams. But the cultists believe this knowledge makes them special, believe their worship generates reciprocal attention, and believe they'll achieve reward or recognition when Cthulhu fully awakens. None of these beliefs find textual support. The cultists have accurate knowledge about reality contaminated by narcissistic interpretation of that knowledge's significance. They cannot accept that knowing about Cthulhu doesn't make Cthulhu care about them. This gap between knowledge and interpretation reveals how humans defend against cosmic indifference by transforming accurate information into religious framework that restores human significance through the back door. Pattern recognition in meaningless data becomes particularly dangerous when the patterns are partially real. Human brains evolved to detect patterns because pattern detection provided survival advantage. Recognizing that rustling grass might indicate predator allowed faster escape response. But this capacity produces false positives, seeing patterns where none exist, especially when processing limited information or ambiguous stimuli. The Cthulhu cult detects real patterns, dreams correlating with seismic events, ancient texts describing entities, archaeological evidence suggesting pre-human civilizations. These patterns exist. The cult's error lies in assuming patterns indicate intention, that correlation suggests causation, that because events align, they must align for human comprehensible reasons. They're correct that Cthulhu influences human dreams during certain periods. They're incorrect in believing this influence represents communication rather than unintentional radiation. The partial accuracy makes their interpretation more dangerous than pure delusion because it cannot be dismissed through simple fact-checking. Why learning about Cthulhu should induce despair rather than fear requires examining the emotional architecture of cosmic horror versus supernatural horror. Fear responds to threat, the possibility of harm to something you value. When facing a predator, fear motivates escape or defense. When facing a ghost, fear motivates exorcism or avoidance. Fear implies the existence of danger that might be survived through appropriate action. Despair responds to inevitability without hope of meaningful resistance. Learning that Cthulhu exists, that it will eventually be free, and that this freedom will render human civilization briefly inconvenient before erasing it entirely should produce despair, because no action addresses the situation. You cannot fight something that operates on such scale. You cannot escape something that exists on the planet you inhabit. You cannot negotiate with something that doesn't register your existence. Fear would be inappropriate. Fear implies the possibility of survival through action. Despair accurately reflects the situation. Something terrible is inevitable, and your awareness changes nothing. The textual evidence that Cthulhu will inevitably be free emerges from the story's geological framing. Arlaye surfaced temporarily in 1925 due to seismic activity. It will surface again when subsequent seismic activity produces similar displacement. Earth's geological processes continue operating regardless of human preference. Plate tectonics will eventually produce configurations where Arlaye surfaces permanently, or where Cthulhu achieves freedom through different geological changes. This might occur in a century, in 10,000 years, or in 1,000,000 years. But the timescale doesn't matter, because inevitability operates independent of timing. The knowledge that something will certainly happen eventually produces despair, regardless of when eventually arrives. And this knowledge changes nothing because human civilization cannot alter plate tectonics, cannot prevent seismic activity, and cannot modify the physical processes that will eventually free what those processes previously imprisoned. Human agency as illusion structures the deepest horror in Lovecraft's framework because it removes the possibility of heroism. Traditional horror allows for human resistance. Vampire hunters stake vampires. Exorcists banish demons. Heroes defeat monsters through courage, intelligence, or sacrifice. Cosmic horror denies these possibilities. Nothing Johansson's crew does meaningfully affects Cthulhu. Ramming the entity produces temporary disruption, then the entity reforms. The crew escapes not through superior tactics, but because astronomical conditions change, submerging Arlaye again. Thurston's investigation achieves nothing. He confirms what happened, but cannot prevent recurrence. The cultists' worship accomplishes nothing. They cannot summon Cthulhu because it's imprisoned geologically, not mystically, and they cannot hasten its freedom because freedom depends on plate tectonics. Every human action in the call of Cthulhu proves futile. This is structurally essential to Lovecraft's project. If humans could meaningfully affect cosmic scale entities, then humans would matter cosmically. The story systematically demonstrates that we don't. The reader's position becomes particularly uncomfortable because we possess knowledge the characters lacked. We read The Call of Cthulhu knowing Johansson survived, knowing Thurston completed his investigation, knowing the world continued after 1925. This knowledge should comfort us. Clearly, Cthulhu's temporary freedom didn't end civilization. But Lovecraft structured the story to deny that comfort. Thurston concludes by hoping he won't be noticed. By acknowledging that all human knowledge about these entities changes nothing, and by recognizing that the only mercy is being too insignificant to warrant attention. We know the world continues, but we also know, because the text explicitly states, that Cthulhu's inevitable permanent freedom will occur eventually. Our temporal distance from 1925 means nothing. We're still waiting for the same inevitability. we still lack capacity to prevent it. We still occupy the same position of cosmic irrelevance the original characters inhabited. The reader cannot achieve superior position through knowledge, because the knowledge confirms our shared helplessness. Misreading as psychological defense mechanism finally explains why Cthulhu became a fightable monster across derivative works. Humans cannot sustain genuine cosmic horror because cosmic horror requires accepting your permanent, unchangeable irrelevance. Our psychology evolved to emphasize agency, to believe our actions matter, to perceive ourselves as significant within our environment. These beliefs provided survival advantage throughout human evolution. Organisms that believe they can affect outcomes try harder to survive. Cosmic horror directly contradicts these evolved biases. It cannot be sustained psychologically without producing the despair Lovecraft's characters experience. So readers, writers, and adapters transform Cthulhu into something fightable, because fighting implies mattering. If we can battle Cthulhu, even if we lose, then we matter enough to be opposed. If heroes can resist, even futilely, then resistance has meaning. Each transformation of cosmic indifference into cosmic battle represents psychological defense against unbearable knowledge. We cannot accept irrelevance. We transform what Lovecraft wrote into something we can bear, and in doing so, we prove his point. Humans will distort reality rather than accept their cosmic position. The Call of Cthulhu stands alone among Lovecraft's fiction as the sole story where the entity functions as primary presence. Yet this singularity requires context within the broader textual ecosystem. Lovecraft, constructed between 1926 and his death in 1937. The story's composition occurred during a period when Lovecraft had begun developing what he called in correspondence his Yog-Sothothery, a loose framework of cosmic entities, forbidden texts, and ancient history that multiple stories could reference without requiring consistency. He wanted verisimilitude, the sensation that these entities existed within a shared reality, without the constraint of coherent mythology. The Call of Cthulhu provided the most complete articulation of this approach, establishing Cthulhu as one example within a cosmos populated by numerous non-human intelligences. The story's three-part structure, the clay sculpture investigation, the Louisiana swamp cult, and the Pacific encounter, allowed Lovecraft to demonstrate how fragmentary evidence from different sources and time periods might converge on confirming something that shouldn't exist according to conventional understanding. The story opens not with action, but with epistemology. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. This first sentence establishes the framework for everything that follows: human cognitive limitation as protective mechanism. Francis Wayland Thurston inherits his uncle George Gamble Angel's research materials after the elderly professor dies under suspicious circumstances. The inheritance structure matters because it emphasizes secondhand knowledge, documents rather than direct experience, and the detective work of assembling fragmentary evidence. Thurston approaches the material as scholar, not as believer, which makes his gradual recognition of the evidence's implications more disturbing. He doesn't want to believe what he discovers. The evidence forces belief despite his resistance. This narrative choice positions the reader alongside Thurston, experiencing the same reluctant comprehension as patterns emerge from chaos. Cross-textual references to Cthulhu appear strategically across Lovecraft's later work, always as background context rather than present threat. The Dunwich Horror, 1928, mentions Great Cthulhu in the same breath as Yog-Sothoth and other entities, positioning it within a hierarchy or catalog of cosmic forces. At the Mountains of Madness, 1931, includes possibly the most significant reference. The Elder Things history mentions Cthulhu and its spawn as arriving from the stars during Earth's early history, warring with the Elder Things, and eventually being imprisoned in R'lyeh when that city sank. This passage provides geological timeline. Cthulhu existed on Earth during the Carboniferous period, roughly 300 million years ago. The reference establishes that Cthulhu represents one player among many in Earth's deep history, not the central antagonist, but one of numerous non-human intelligences that have occupied the planet across different epochs. The Shadow Out of Time, 1934 to 35, includes briefer mention, noting that the great race of Yith's histories reference the Cthulhu spawn among other entities the great race observed across their temporal investigations. These references accumulate to create what we might term cosmic context, a universe where Earth has hosted multiple intelligent species across its history, where humanity represents recent arrival rather than special creation, and where entities like Cthulhu are neither unique nor particularly remarkable from sufficiently vast perspective. Lovecraft's technique involves mentioning these entities casually, embedded within larger histories, presented as established fact within the fictional universe. This casual treatment performs important philosophical work. It normalizes the abnormal, suggesting that from cosmic perspective, Cthulhu is simply one entity among many, remarkable to humans only because humans lack reference points for comprehending non-human consciousness. The distinction between Cthulhu references versus Cthulhu appearances reveals Lovecraft's restraint in deploying his most iconic creation. After 1928, Cthulhu never appears directly in any Lovecraft story. It receives mentions, historical references, and contextual positioning, but it never manifests as active presence within the narrative. This absence is calculated. Overuse would domesticate the entity, making it familiar rather than alien. By referencing Cthulhu while withholding its presence, Lovecraft maintained its effectiveness as symbol of cosmic horror while allowing other entities, Yog-Sothoth in The Dunwich Horror, the Elder Things in At the Mountains of Madness, the Great Race in The Shadow Out of Time, to demonstrate that the framework applies across multiple manifestations. Cthulhu becomes exemplar rather than exception, the entity that established the pattern other stories could deploy with variation. The Great Old One's pantheon, such as it exists in Lovecraft's work, emerges through accretion rather than systematic design. Different stories mention different entities, sometimes positioning them hierarchically, sometimes treating them as equivalent powers, sometimes suggesting they're fundamentally incomparable. Azathoth appears as nuclear chaos at the center of infinity. Yog-Sothoth exists coterminously with all space and time. Shub-Niggurath receives invocation as fertility entity. Nyarlathotep operates as messenger or manifestation of other entities' will. Cthulhu occupies position somewhere below the truly cosmic scale entities, but far above human comprehension, powerful enough to render human civilization irrelevant, localized enough to be geologically imprisoned, ancient enough to predate human evolution by millions of years. This positioning matters because it establishes scales within scale, suggesting that even among entities humans cannot comprehend, vast differences in power and temporal scope exist. We are not simply facing one category of incomprehensible entity, but multiple orders of magnitude beyond human reference. What other stories reveal about Cthulhu's nature comes primarily through absence and implication. If the Elder Things could war with Cthulhu's spawn and survive, then Cthulhu is not omnipotent by any cosmic standard. If R'lyeh could sink and imprison its inhabitants, then they remain subject to physical law, even if that law permits configurations humans find impossible. If the stars being wrong prevents Cthulhu from acting freely, then astronomical configurations constrain its activity through mechanisms that operate independent of its will. These limitations don't diminish cosmic horror, they refine it. Cthulhu isn't terrifying because it's all-powerful. It's terrifying because even constrained, even limited, even subject to physical law, it operates on scales where humanity remains cosmically irrelevant. The entity can be imprisoned and still represent insurmountable difference between human and cosmic scale. This is perhaps Lovecraft's most sophisticated achievement, creating horror that doesn't require omnipotence, only sufficient scale to render human significance null. The story's tripartite structure functions as epistemological progression, from artifact to testimony to direct encounter, with each section providing evidence type that builds toward confirmation while maintaining ambiguity. Part 1, The Horror in Clay, introduces the investigation through Henry Anthony Wilcox, a young sculptor who creates a disturbing bas-relief during a period of fevered dreams in March 1925. The sculpture depicts a creature of vaguely anthropoid outline, but with an octopus-like head whose face was a mass of feelers, a scaly, rubbery-looking body, prodigious claws on hind and fore feet, and long, narrow wings behind. Wilcox produces this image involuntarily, driven by nightmares he cannot explain, and the sculpture disturbs him despite being his own creation. Professor Angel investigates, learning that Wilcox's dreams coincided with a widespread phenomenon. Artists, visionaries, and sensitive individuals across multiple continents experienced similar nightmares during the same period. This correlation suggests transmission rather than coincidence, pattern rather than individual pathology. The dreams themselves resist coherent description, fragmenting into impressions of cyclopean architecture, non-Euclidean geometry, and crushing sensations of vast spaces and immense presences. Lovecraft's language emphasizes the limits of description. Witnesses struggle to articulate what they perceived, resorting to contradictory terms and spatial impossibilities. This linguistic breakdown is structural rather than stylistic failure. The witnesses lack vocabulary for experiences that violate the spatial and geometric assumptions embedded in human language. When Wilcox describes angles all wrong, he's attempting to communicate perception of space organized through principles his cognitive equipment cannot process. The fever that accompanies his dreams suggests physiological response to neural overload, his brain attempting to organize impossible sensory information produces somatic symptoms as biological protest against cognitive impossibility. Part 2, The Tale of Inspector Legrasse, shifts temporal and geographic focus to November 1907, when New Orleans police raided a swamp cult engaged in what contemporary observers described as voodoo orgy. The cult consisted of approximately 100 individuals of a very low, mixed-blooded, and mentally aberrant type, dancing around a fire and chanting an unknown language while conducting human sacrifice. The local black population had reported the cult to authorities, providing crucial detail. This wasn't romanticized occultism practiced by educated dabblers, but pathological behavior by damaged individuals. Legrasse's raid captured numerous cultists and recovered a hideous statuette depicting the same entity Wilcox would sculpt 18 years later. The captured cultists provided fragmentary information about their beliefs. They worshipped great Cthulhu, maintained that their deity lay dreaming in Relaya, and claimed that when the stars were right, Cthulhu would wake and reclaim Earth. The chant the cultists repeated provides the story's most iconic element, Finglui Mulwunaf, Cthulhu Reliech Wgahnagul Ftagan. One cultist, identified as a very aged mestizo named Castro, provided translation. In his house at Arlie, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. This translation has achieved canonical status, yet the text provides no independent verification. Castro's interpretation might be accurate, or it might represent what someone with limited understanding assumes the chant means based on context. The unverifiability matters because it maintains epistemic uncertainty, even within confirmation. We learn something exists, but our knowledge about that thing remains mediated through unreliable witnesses who may be misinterpreting what they have encountered. Castro's further exposition describes Cthulhu's history. The entity and its kind came from the stars when Earth was young, built cities, and fell into dormancy when Rillier sank beneath Pacific waters. They wait for the time when the stars would be right again, when Rillier would rise, and when Cthulhu would wake to resume its existence. Note what this narrative omits. There is no conquest, no destruction of humanity, no apocalyptic battle. The cultists believe Cthulhu will wake and exist. Human civilization is not mentioned because human civilization is irrelevant to the event they're describing. Part 3. The Madness from the Sea delivers direct encounter through Johansson's manuscript, discovered by Thurston after the Norwegian sailor's death. In March 1925, the same period when Wilcox and others experienced nightmares, the Alert, a steamship traveling in the South Pacific, encountered survivors from the yacht Emma, who had mutinied and murdered their officers. The Alert crew overcame these individuals, then discovered coordinates that led to recently surfaced land, Relaya. The description of approaching the city emphasizes perceptual breakdown. Johansson and his men landed at a sloping mud bank on this monstrous acropolis and clambered slipperily up over Titan oozy blocks, which could have been no mortal staircase. The architecture defies spatial logic. Surfaces that should be horizontal appear vertical. Distances shift inconsistently, and the very stone seems wrong in ways that produce nausea in observers. When Cthulhu emerges from the city, Johansson's description fragments entirely. The thing cannot be described. There is no language for such abysms of shrieking and immemorial lunacy, such eldritch contradictions of all matter, force, and cosmic order. He attempts physical description, but resorts to contradictory terms. The entity appears simultaneously gelatinous and solid. Its size seems to vary, and its movements violate spatial consistency. When the crew attempts escape, Cthulhu moves toward them. Johansson, in desperation, turns the Alert around and rams the steamship directly into Cthulhu's head. The impact produces explosive disruption. The awful squid head with writhing feelers came nearly up to the bowsprit of the sturdy yacht, but Johansson drove on relentlessly. There was a bursting as of an exploding bladder, a slushy nastiness as of a cloven sunfish, a stench as of 1,000 opened graves, and a sound that the chronicler could not put on paper. The entity's head explodes, then reforms, and Cthulhu continues movement as if the collision were minor interruption rather than meaningful damage. The crew escapes because Arlaye begins sinking again. Astronomical conditions have changed. The stars are no longer right, and geological forces that temporarily raised the city reverse. Johansen survives long enough to document the encounter, then dies, under circumstances suggesting psychological collapse rather than physical injury. His manuscript provides the only eyewitness account of Cthulhu's physical form and behavior, yet that account raises more questions than it answers. Did they encounter Cthulhu's actual body or some projection? Was the entity aware of their presence, or did it simply move through space they occupied? Did ramming it accomplish anything, or would it have returned to dormancy regardless of their actions? The text refuses to resolve these ambiguities because resolution would provide closure, and closure would suggest human capacity for understanding. Thurston assembles these three evidence streams: Wilcox's sculpture and dreams, Legrasse's cult discovery, Johansen's direct encounter, and recognizes they describe the same phenomenon from different angles. The correlation confirms something exists. The details confirm it operates on scales and through mechanisms humans cannot fully comprehend. And the conclusion Thurston reaches provides no comfort. The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents. We live on a placid island of ignorance in the midst of black seas of infinity, and it was not meant that we should voyage far. He knows now. The knowledge accomplishes nothing except to mark him as potentially dangerous, not because he can act on the knowledge, but because he possesses it. His final paragraphs express hope that his death will appear natural, that the entities whose existence he's confirmed won't notice his investigation. Even confirmation of cosmic horror provides no agency, only the burden of knowing something you cannot address and cannot unlearn. The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1931, complicates and clarifies Cthulhu mythology by introducing related entities, the Deep Ones and Dagon, while demonstrating how cosmic horror operates through gradual corruption rather than sudden apocalypse. The story follows an unnamed narrator investigating the decayed fishing town of Innsmouth, Massachusetts, discovering that its population has interbred with amphibious entities from the ocean depths. The deep ones are described as frogfish hybrids, bipedal, but clearly non-human, capable of living indefinitely in ocean depths and maintaining civilization beneath the waves. They worship Dagon and Cthulhu, though the text never clarifies whether these entities are biologically related, hierarchically connected, or simply worshipped by the same species. This ambiguity proves crucial. Lovecraft refused to systematize his cosmic entities into coherent taxonomy because systematization would make them comprehensible. The Esoteric Order of Dagon, the religious organization that controls Innsmouth, practices worship that resembles the Louisiana cult from the Call of Cthulhu, while differing in crucial particulars. The Innsmouth cultists aren't damaged individuals engaging in pathological behavior. They're successful merchants and sea captains who made deliberate bargain with the Deep Ones in exchange for fishing prosperity and eventual biological transformation. Captain Obed Marsh, the historical founder of the Pact, learned about the Deep Ones from Pacific Islanders during his trading voyages, then imported this knowledge to Innsmouth when fishing declined in the 1840s. The pragmatic origin matters. These aren't mystics seeking cosmic truth, but businessmen pursuing economic advantage. They worship the Deep Ones because worship produces tangible benefits: abundant fishing, gold artifacts from underwater cities, and eventual physical transformation that grants effective immortality. The transformation narrative provides the story's central horror, operating through biological inevitability rather than supernatural curse. Humans who interbreed with deep ones produce offspring that appear initially human, but begin metamorphosing in adulthood. The process is gradual. Skin becomes rougher and develops greenish tint. Eyes bulge and refuse to close completely. The neck develops gills, hands and feet become webbed, and the spine curves. The transformed individual eventually cannot survive on land and must enter the ocean permanently, joining the deep ones in their underwater cities. This transformation is presented as biological process, not punishment or possession. The deep one genetics express themselves according to developmental timeline, and the human subject has no capacity to prevent or reverse the change. The narrator discovers through genealogical research that his own family derives from Innsmouth, meaning he carries the genetic legacy and will eventually undergo transformation himself. How Innsmouth complicates Cthulhu mythology becomes apparent through the relationship between worship and reality. The deep ones genuinely exist. The narrator encounters them directly. The government raid on Innsmouth discovers physical evidence, and the transformation process operates according to observable biological principles. Their worship of Dagon and Cthulhu suggests these entities also exist, yet the text provides no evidence that either entity notices or reciprocates worship. The deep ones might worship Cthulhu because they possess knowledge about its existence, not because Cthulhu demands worship or rewards worshippers. This distinction matters enormously. Traditional religious frameworks assume reciprocal relationship. Gods demand worship and provide benefits or punishment. Lovecraft's framework suggests instead that worship might be one-directional. Organisms might worship entities that don't notice worship, continuing religious practice because tradition, because social cohesion, or because psychological need to believe their existence has cosmic significance. The government raid on Innsmouth in 1928 provides the story's climax, demonstrating state power's capacity to suppress local cult activity while remaining powerless against cosmic-scale forces. Federal agents, accompanied by military support, raid Innsmouth, arrest numerous cultists, dynamite the esoteric Order of Dagon's headquarters, and torpedo submarine sections of the town where deep ones might be sheltering. The raid successfully destroys the cult's organizational infrastructure and disperses its human practitioners. But the deep ones remain in the ocean depths, unaffected by surface activities. The underwater cities continue operating. The entities themselves prove immune to government intervention because they exist outside governmental jurisdiction, not legally, but physically, inhabiting spaces where human authority cannot extend. The raid accomplishes surface-level suppression while leaving the underlying reality unchanged. The narrator's transformation trajectory reveals cosmic horror's most intimate operation: the recognition that you are not what you believed yourself to be. He begins the story as human investigating strange town, discovers his family, connection to Innsmouth, learns about the Deep One heritage, and concludes by acknowledging his inevitable transformation with something approaching acceptance or resignation. The final paragraphs describe his plan to free his cousin from the asylum where she's confined, then together enter the ocean and join the Deep Ones in their city. This isn't defeat through external force, but recognition of internal inevitability. His genetics will express themselves regardless of his preferences, and resistance would only prolong suffering. The transformation doesn't corrupt him morally. It reveals what he always was, biologically. Human identity is superficial layer over biological reality, and that biological reality will assert itself according to genetic programming. Textual evidence of Cthulhu's irrelevance to Innsmouth events accumulates through systematic absence. Despite the esoteric order of Dagon worshipping Cthulhu, alongside Dagon, Cthulhu never appears in the narrative, never influences events, and never responds to worship. The Deep Ones apparently know about Cthulhu. Their traditions reference it, but this knowledge produces no interaction. Cthulhu remains imprisoned in R'lyeh throughout the Innsmouth timeline, neither helping nor hindering the Deep Ones, neither blessing nor cursing their human allies. This absence demonstrates that worship doesn't generate divine attention, that knowing about cosmic entities doesn't grant relationship with them, and that human, or Deep One, religious practice operates independent of the entities ostensibly being worshipped. Innsmouth could have occurred identically if Cthulhu didn't exist. The Deep Ones would still interbreed with humans, transformation would still occur, and the worship would still provide social cohesion, regardless of whether the worshipped entity notices. The story clarifies Lovecraft's framework by demonstrating cosmic horror, operating through biology, genetics, and deep time, rather than through supernatural intervention. Nothing in The Shadow over Innsmouth requires magic. The Deep Ones are biological entities. Transformation follows genetic programming, and the underwater cities represent non-human, but still material civilization. The horror emerges from recognizing that Earth hosts multiple intelligent species, that human biology is mutable when combined with non-human genetics, and that transformation can be inevitable regardless of individual preference. The connection to Cthulhu exists as background context, mythology shared by entities that know more about cosmic history than humans do, but Cthulhu itself remains absent, imprisoned, irrelevant to the immediate events. This irrelevance is the point. Cosmic horror doesn't require active intervention from cosmic entities. Their mere existence reconfigures what's possible, what's real, and what humans might become. August Derleth's posthumous systematization of Lovecraft's work into the Cthulhu Mythos represents the most influential misreading in cosmic horror's history, transforming philosophical framework into adventure mythology through the imposition of moral structure Lovecraft explicitly rejected. After Lovecraft's death in 1937, Derleth, as literary executor and founder of Arkham House, the press that preserved Lovecraft's work, began organizing the scattered references to cosmic entities into coherent pantheon. He introduced the concept of elder gods as benevolent deities opposed to the malevolent Great Old Ones, positioning Cthulhu, Azathoth, and Yog-Sothoth as evil forces being opposed by good ones. This framework transformed cosmic indifference into cosmic war, replaced philosophical horror with moral drama, and made humanity cosmically significant again by positioning us within a conflict between good and evil. Every element of this systematization contradicted Lovecraft's explicit philosophical position, yet it became the template for decades of derivative fiction. The Elder, God's invention, particularly distorts Lovecraft's framework because it restores precisely the moral scaffolding cosmic horror was designed to demolish. In Derleth's schema, the elder gods imprisoned the Great Old Ones in various locations, Cthulhu in R'lyeh, others elsewhere, and maintain vigilance against their escape. This introduces divine justice, suggests the universe operates according to moral principles, and implies that good ultimately constrains evil. But Lovecraft's texts contain no benevolent cosmic entities. His elder things from At the Mountains of Madness are ancient, but they're not gods and they're not benevolent. They're alien organisms pursuing their own goals with complete indifference to human welfare. The term elder gods appears nowhere in Lovecraft's fiction. Derleth invented it, attributed it to Lovecraft, and used his authority as literary executor to canonize the invention. Subsequent writers, assuming Derleth possessed special access to Lovecraft's intentions, accepted the framework without verifying its textual basis. The good versus evil dichotomy Derleth imposed makes Cthulhu fightable by making the cosmos morally legible. If evil gods oppose good gods, then humanity can ally with good and potentially influence the conflict's outcome. This restores human agency, makes individual choices cosmically significant, and transforms cosmic horror into cosmic adventure. Characters in Derleth's stories and in fiction influenced by his framework can fight Cthulhu using rituals derived from elder god knowledge, can banish entities through proper incantations, and can meaningfully resist cosmic forces. This represents complete inversion of Lovecraft's project. Where Lovecraft wrote to demonstrate human insignificance, Derleth wrote to restore human importance. Where Lovecraft's entities didn't notice humanity, Derleth's entities engage in direct conflict with human cultists and defenders. The philosophical weight vanishes, replaced by adventure narrative that happens to feature tentacled entities. Lynn Carter and Brian Lumley expanded Lovecraft's mythos during the 1970s and 1980s, often transforming cosmic horror into power fantasy through protagonists who master forbidden knowledge and use it to battle cosmic entities on relatively equal footing. Lumley's Titus Crow series depicts an occult detective who travels through dimensions, battles Cthulhu's minions, and treats the Great Old Ones as powerful adversaries rather than incomprehensible forces. Carter's additions to the mythos introduce new entities while maintaining Derleth's good versus evil framework, creating increasingly baroque genealogies and hierarchies that made the cosmic pantheon resemble Greek mythology more than Lovecraft's original vision. These expansions proved commercially successful. They provided readers with heroes, clear conflicts, and achievable victories, but they accomplished this success by abandoning the philosophical foundation that made Lovecraft's work distinctive. Chaosium's Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, first published in 1981, has influenced popular understanding of Lovecraft's work, perhaps more than any other adaptation. The game necessarily makes players matter within the cosmic horror framework, because games require player agency. Choices must have consequences, actions must produce effects, and players must be able to meaningfully influence outcomes. The game handles this through sanity mechanics, where encountering cosmic entities produces psychological damage, but doesn't necessarily prevent eventual success. Players can investigate cults, thwart summoning rituals, and occasionally banish entities, achieving victories that Lovecraft's fiction never permits. The game is excellent at what it attempts, providing entertaining gameplay using Lovecraftian aesthetics, but it fundamentally misrepresents the source material by making human action significant. Millions of people have encountered Lovecraft through this game, learning a version where heroes matter, where knowledge provides power, and where entities can be fought. This ludic adaptation has shaped interpretation more powerfully than scholarly analysis ever could. The summoning misreading across derivative works emerges naturally from adventure narrative requirements, but contradicts textual evidence throughout Lovecraft's fiction. Countless stories, games, and films depict cultists or sorcerers attempting to summon Cthulhu, implying that sufficient ritual knowledge and proper execution can bring the entity forth. But the Call of Cthulhu presents the opposite. Cthulhu becomes temporarily active because geological processes freed Arlie, not because cultists summoned it. The cultists worship and wait, they possess no capacity to hasten Cthulhu's awakening. The stars being right refers to astronomical conditions that correlate with geological activity, not to ritual requirements. Summoning implies human capacity to compel cosmic entities to appear, which grants humans significant power and makes the cosmos responsive to human action. Lovecraft's framework denies both propositions. Entities appear or don't based on conditions beyond human influence. We cannot summon what we cannot compel, and we cannot compel forces operating on cosmic scales. How each layer of adaptation distances from original text follows predictable pattern. Each iteration adds agency, adds hope, adds the possibility of meaningful resistance. Lovecraft wrote stories where knowledge produced despair and action accomplished nothing. First-generation derivative works, Derleth, added the possibility of fighting back using elder god assistance. Second-generation works, Lumley Carter, made fighting back routinely successful for protagonists with proper knowledge. Third-generation works, games, films, made players/viewers the heroes of stories where they routinely defeat or banish cosmic entities. Each generation preserved aesthetic elements, tentacles, non-Euclidean geometry, ancient texts, cyclopean architecture, while removing philosophical content. The adaptations look like Lovecraft while meaning the opposite of what Lovecraft meant. They demonstrate that human psychology requires hope, requires agency, requires the belief that individual actions matter. We cannot sustain cosmic horror, so we transform it into something bearable. Scholarly attempts to recover Lovecraft's actual framework have intensified since the 1990s, particularly through S.T. Joshi's biographical and critical work, Michel Houellebecq's philosophical analysis, and China Miéville's Marxist reading. These scholars emphasize Lovecraft's materialism, his rejection of supernatural explanation, and his commitment to demonstrating human cosmic insignificance. They've documented the distance between Lovecraft's texts and popular understanding, cataloging the specific distortions Derleth and others introduced. But scholarly correction influences academic discourse more than popular culture. The average reader, gamer, or film viewer encounters Lovecraft through adaptations that have already transformed cosmic indifference into defeatable evil. Correcting this misunderstanding requires not just scholarly argument, but cultural shift in what audiences want from horror. And that shift requires accepting psychological discomfort that most people reasonably prefer to avoid. We know what Lovecraft wrote. We consistently choose to engage with versions that tell us we matter instead. The Necronomicon forgeries began appearing within years of Lovecraft's death, demonstrating how fictional texts generate material reality through collective belief and commercial opportunity. The most influential forgery emerged in 1977 when Simon, pseudonym for author Peter Levenda, published the Simon Necronomicon, claiming to be translation of ancient Mesopotamian grimoire discovered in a cult bookshop. The text combined Sumerian, mythology, Lovecraft's invented entities, and ceremonial magic instructions, creating hybrid document that acknowledged fictional origin while presenting itself as operative magical system. The Simon edition sold hundreds of thousands of copies, generated sequels, and convinced entire generations of occultists that Lovecraft had somehow accessed real forbidden knowledge despite his documented atheism and materialism. Why people create and believe these forgeries reveals something profound about human relationship with forbidden knowledge. Real grimoires exist but remain difficult to access, written in archaic languages, requiring extensive occult scholarship to interpret. Lovecraft's Necronomicon promises equivalent power without equivalent difficulty. It's written in English. Its rituals can be performed by contemporary practitioners, and its very notoriety suggests effectiveness. The forgeries satisfy desire for secret knowledge that grants power while requiring minimal qualification. They democratize the forbidden, making cosmic secrets available to anyone willing to purchase a paperback. This commercialization mirrors Lovecraft's own critique. People want cosmic significance, will pay money for texts promising significance, and will believe those texts work despite absence of evidence because the alternative is accepting their cosmic irrelevance. Relia coordinate speculation has generated multiple ocean floor expeditions and countless online investigations attempting to locate Cthulhu's sunken city using coordinates derived from the Call of Cthulhu. Lovecraft provided coordinates: 47 degrees 9 minutes south, 126 degrees 43 minutes west, a location in the South Pacific, roughly equidistant from New Zealand, South America, and Antarctica. This area happens to coincide approximately with Point Nemo, the oceanic pole of inaccessibility, the location farthest from any landmass, where decommissioned satellites are deliberately crashed to minimize risk to human populations. The Biwiki Das coincidence has fueled speculation that Lovecraft somehow knew about this location's significance, though Point Nemo wasn't calculated as specific coordinate until 1992. Cthulhu cultist subcultures have emerged online and occasionally manifest in physical space, ranging from ironic performance to apparently sincere belief. Actual religious organizations have incorporated Lovecraftian elements. The Church of Starry Wisdom in New Zealand operated openly before dissolution, and scattered esoteric Order of Dagon groups have appeared in multiple countries. Whether these organizations represent sincere theological positions or elaborate performance art remains deliberately ambiguous, which may be precisely the point. The ambiguity itself generates the sensation of hidden truth just beyond confirmation. Why cosmic horror attracts sincere occultism despite philosophical incompatibility reveals tension between Lovecraft's intent and human psychological needs. Lovecraft wrote explicitly, "Mechanistic universe where consciousness emerges accidentally and possesses no cosmic significance." Occultism assumes consciousness is fundamental, that will can influence reality, and that human spiritual development has cosmic importance. These positions are contradictory. You cannot simultaneously believe the universe is mechanistic indifference and believe your ritual magic compels entities to respond. Yet, occultists regularly incorporate Lovecraftian entities into practical work, invoking Cthulhu or Yog-Sothoth as if they were traditional spirits responsive to human will. The result is spiritualized Lovecraft, where cosmic horror becomes cosmic adventure, and indifferent entities become responsive partners in magical work. Film adaptations of Lovecraft's work have consistently prioritized body horror over cosmic horror, replacing philosophical dread with visceral disgust, because cinema struggles to represent conceptual impossibility, but excels at depicting physical transformation. Stuart Gordon's adaptations, Reanimator, 1985, From Beyond, 1986, Dagon, 2001, exemplify this transformation through their emphasis on gore, mutation, and visible monstrosity. Gordon's approach acknowledges that Lovecraft's actual philosophy doesn't translate to commercial cinema without radical revision, so he extracts the aesthetic shock value while discarding the conceptual framework. Call of Cthulhu role-playing game has influenced 3 generations of players' understanding of Lovecraft. necessarily transforming cosmic horror into playable horror by granting players agency Lovecraft's fiction denies. The game's core mechanic revolves around sanity as resource. Characters begin with sanity, points that decrease when encountering cosmic entities or learning forbidden truths. And zero sanity means insanity and character unplayability. This gamifies madness, making it measurable quantity that players can strategically manage rather than inevitable consequence of accurate comprehension. Players investigate cults, research ancient texts, and sometimes directly confront entities. All activities that produce experience points, advance character development, and occasionally result in victory. Chaosium's game has shaped popular understanding more than any scholarly analysis because it transformed passive readers into active participants. Players who spend years in Call of Cthulhu campaigns develop deep familiarity with Lovecraft's creatures, locations, and texts through repeated mechanical interaction. They learn that casting spells costs sanity points, that certain rituals can banish entities, and that proper preparation allows survival. This mechanical literacy becomes interpretive framework applied backward onto source texts. Players assume Lovecraft's stories work like the game, that his characters could have survived through better preparation, and that the fictional universe contains methods for resisting cosmic forces. The Cute Cthulhu phenomenon represents ultimate defanging of cosmic horror, transforming entity symbolizing human insignificance into marketable plush toy for children. Cthulhu plushies, cartoon Cthulhus with adorable eyes, Cthulhu slippers. The merchandise proliferates endlessly, each instance making the entity cuddly rather than terrifying. This domestication demonstrates capitalism's capacity to commodify any symbol regardless of original meaning. We cannot market existential dread to mass audiences, so we market tentacled plushies instead, and the original meaning evaporates through repetition. Chaos Magic's adoption of Cthulhu as egregore, thought form created through collective belief, represents philosophical inversion so complete it becomes almost elegant in its wrongness. Chaos magicians argue that Lovecraft's entities have become real through decades of belief, artistic representation, and invocation. This framework allows magicians to work with Lovecraftian entities, practically while acknowledging fictional origin. The egregore framework misses Lovecraft's point spectacularly. Cthulhu was designed to represent something that exists regardless of human belief, that predates human consciousness by millions of years, and that will outlast humanity's extinction. Treating Cthulhu as thought form created through collective imagination makes humanity central again. We created this entity through our mental activity, which means human consciousness holds power over cosmic forces. Academic Lovecraft studies has intensified since the 1990s, producing rigorous biographical work, philosophical analysis, and cultural criticism that attempts to recover Lovecraft's actual positions from decades of misinterpretation. S.T. Joshi's biographical work provides definitive documentation of Lovecraft's life and philosophical development. Michel Houellebecq's H.P. Lovecraft, Against the World, Against Life, 2005, positions Lovecraft as literary philosopher whose cosmic horror articulates modernity's fundamental condition, the recognition that scientific materialism has stripped meaning from existence without providing replacement consolations. New Weird Literature's relationship to Lovecraft demonstrates both debt and departure, acknowledging cosmic horror's influence while rejecting its political implications and racial anxieties. Authors like China Miéville, Jeff Vandermeer, and Caitlin R. Kiernan deploy Lovecraftian aesthetics while removing or inverting the xenophobia that permeates Lovecraft's work. The new weird retains cosmic vastness while recovering possibility of meaning, suggesting universe might be strange without being indifferent. How each appropriation reveals what culture needs Cthulhu to be maps, political and psychological landscapes more than it recovers Lovecraft's intent. Chaos magicians need Cthulhu to be workable entity because their practice requires entities that respond to ritual. New weird authors need Cthulhu's aesthetics without its nihilism because their fiction requires strangeness that doesn't preclude meaning. Each appropriation extracts elements that serve specific cultural work while discarding elements that don't. Why misreading is psychologically necessary rather than merely convenient becomes clear when examining what accepting cosmic indifference would require. Humans evolved cognitive biases that assume agency, meaning, and significance because these assumptions provided survival advantages throughout our evolutionary history. Pattern recognition that produces false positives survived because the cost of false positive was lower than cost of false negative. This psychological architecture makes us pattern-seeking, meaning-making organisms who instinctively resist accepting that patterns might be coincidental, and meaning might be locally generated rather than cosmically embedded. The comfort of mattering, even as victims, explains why derivative works consistently transform cosmic indifference into active hostility. Being targeted by malevolent force confirms you matter enough to warrant targeting. Conspiracy theories demonstrate this principle. People prefer believing powerful groups conspire against them, rather than accepting that suffering results from impersonal systems, random chance, or their own limitations. The conspiracy at least implies you matter enough to conspire against. Similarly, Cthulhu as malevolent destroyer implies humanity matters enough for cosmic entity to notice and attempt to destroy. Lovecraft's Cthulhu, moving through space humans happen to occupy without registering their presence, denies even this consolation. Terror management theory research demonstrates that reminding people of mortality increases defense of cultural worldviews, hostility toward outgroups, and investment in meaning-making activities. Cosmic horror confronts readers not merely with individual mortality, but with cosmic meaninglessness, a threat several orders of magnitude beyond death anxiety. Each transformation that makes Cthulhu fightable, makes cultists powerful, or makes forbidden knowledge useful represents psychological defense against threat that our cognitive architecture cannot process without experiencing anxiety that provides no adaptive advantage. Why we cannot sustain genuine cosmic horror relates to how consciousness functions rather than to weakness of will or insufficient understanding. Consciousness appears to be narrative-generating process. We experience reality through stories we tell about ourselves, where our actions matter to outcomes and where events connect through meaningful causation. Cosmic horror denies narrative structure. Events occur without meaningful connection. Actions accomplish nothing cosmically significant, and comprehension reveals absence of meaning rather than hidden truth. We can achieve it temporarily during reading or film viewing, but consciousness naturally reverts to narrative mode, because that mode allows functioning. The text's prediction of its own misreading appears explicitly in The Call of Cthulhu, through Thurston's opening statement about cognitive limitation as mercy. Lovecraft knew humans cannot correlate all contents of consciousness without psychological breakdown. He knew providing this knowledge in fiction form would be misread, transformed, and domesticated, because sustained cosmic horror is psychologically intolerable. Each misreading proves his point about human cognitive limitations, while undermining his attempt to communicate those limitations. Living with cosmic indifference as unavoidable conclusion presents philosophical problem without clear resolution. Lovecraft himself struggled with this throughout his life. His letters show someone who intellectually accepted cosmic indifference while emotionally suffering from that acceptance. This might represent the only sustainable approach, accepting cosmic indifference intellectually while pursuing local meaning practically, acknowledging the contradiction without requiring resolution. We live as if we matter while knowing we don't, maintain relationships as if they have cosmic significance while recognizing they don't, create art and scholarship as if they'll outlast us while accepting they won't. The possibility that Lovecraft was more right than he knew emerges from recent developments in cosmology and physics. The universe is expanding at accelerating rate, driven by dark energy we don't understand. Earth itself will be consumed when the sun expands into red giant in approximately 5 billion years, eliminating any trace of human civilization unless we achieve interstellar travel. Our existence is temporary, our records are ephemeral, and the cosmos continues according to physical law, regardless of whether consciousness observes it. Lovecraft articulated this through Gothic horror aesthetics in 1926, but contemporary physics confirms the basic framework. Consciousness appears to be local phenomenon, possibly unique to Earth, certainly temporary, operating within universe that contains no evidence of caring whether consciousness exists.